Today, we catch up with Victor Betts, a library fellow at North Carolina State University Libraries. He has a dual appointments in the Special Collections Research Center and the Student Success Division. He conducts library instruction, outreach, and archival research with a focus on underrepresented populations at the university. He completed his undergrad at UC Riverside and has a master's in Library and Information Science from San Jose State University. So, Victor, you developed the Asian and Asian American historical state timeline at NC State. Can you tell us about your process in putting that together?
Yeah, so I think it was summer of 2019. One of my first tasks working in the special collections was to find new additional materials for this African American woman named Justina Williams. And she was the first African American academic that was hired at NC State in 1958. So this is the era of Jim Crow. And then while I was looking through the collections of the genetics department, where she worked at, I wasn't able to find any new additional materials pertaining to her. However, I found lots of materials pertaining to Asian faculty members and researchers. And I realized that there really was sort of a absence or a disconnect between the larger stories and narratives and presence around Asian and Asian Americans in the university and what we have buried in the archives. So it sort of sparked my curiosity or my archival research into digging deeper into the history and materials related to Asians and Asian Americans at the university. And then so I started to do it, and then I at the end developed this timeline to kind of really showcase, kind of curate the information for our researchers.
Did you come across gaps and silences in the archives?
Yeah, so there are lots of gaps and silences definitely exist in the archives historically, right, and throughout the nation, and definitely bumping into not finding new additional materials for Justina Williams was definitely a gap. Um, but especially gaps and silences particularly exist with underrepresented communities, right? So their voices, their narratives, their lived experiences are not commonly found in the archives.
So, what does that mean to your research?
Yes, yeah. So gaps and silences in the archives means, I think, in one aspect that there aren't an abundance of materials that are readily available and accessible for our researchers compared to other materials in the archives, right? So for example, at the university where I work there's lots of archival materials pertaining to the history of white men at the university, the presidents, the faculty members, students. However, the experiences or voices of African American, Asian, or Asian Americans, indigenous populations, or even Native Americans are rarely found in the archives, and also in the collective memory or the retelling of the legacies around the university and how that history is sort of passed down generationally.
Mhm. So, what was some interesting information that you found during your research?
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that, when you dig through the archives, especially in pertaining to the Asian timeline, we had a lot of materials pertaining to Asian students and faculty members. And then one of my approaches when I was developing this timeline, also my approach in kind of doing this type of research is that oftentimes when it comes to the stories of Asian American or Asian American history in the US, it sort of gets focused solely or heavily on East Asians. So for example, especially in California or the Pacific Northwest and in New York City, for example, I think stories around Chinese, Japanese, and Korean communities often get centered. So I wanted to really make sure that I also ask the questions of like whose voices are I'm not hearing in the stories of Asian and Asian Americans. So making sure that I try to do my best to find stories around Southeast Asians, Cambodians, Lao, Hmong populations, making sure that I also try to also bring it a little bit, contextualize it locally for North Carolinians, and also for the university itself. So I really try to be as much inclusive within the story of Asians and Asian Americans.
Cool. And so why is your work important? Why is this kind of work important?
Yeah, I think this type of work is important because it centers the voice and sort of experiences of silenced and or forgotten histories of marginalized populations and disenfranchised communities. And I think it's really important to really critically analyze archival materials to help us understand the historical connections and context to larger systemic issues through the narratives and lives of marginalized communities, right? And particularly in this current moment of COVID-19 and racial injustice. So whether that is anti-Asian violence and bias uh, with the influence with COVID-19 and coronavirus, and also the current racial injustices pertaining to Black lives and not just locally in the US, but also in a global context as well too.
Mm. Well, Victor, thank you so much for sharing, your perspectives and your research, and I hope to see you soon.
Great, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.